Welcome today to our third edition of our PPP Loan Forgiveness webinars. Today we've updated our content with some of the most common questions and issues that we've seen as we've started to review your individual forgiveness applications. I am going to open it up as well for any sort of questions that you might have that we aren't going to address already in the slide deck. Put your questions in the chat box and use that Q&A functionality, and we will be able to answer you as we go along here. So first of all, a welcome. Again, my name is Laurel Sykes. I'm the Chief Compliance and Risk Officer here at American Riviera Bank, and I will be guiding you through some of these more complex forgiveness issues. Just a couple of logistical items. I do want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. We will be posting it on our PPP webpage of our website if you do want to view it later. In the meantime, as I mentioned before, please type your questions into the Q&A box and we'll try to get through them at the end of the presentation. If we are unable to get to them all, again, I want to remind you that we'll be keeping track of all of them, and we will be sending out an email to all of our PPP clients with the Q&As of anything that we did answer today live, and also anything that we were unable to get through in the time that we've got allocated today. So let's get started here. I think the last time that we spoke with you all was in July, so it's been 2 months since our last forgiveness webinar. I did want to remind you, as before, that this is really just intended for educational purposes. We do highly encourage you to check with your legal and financial advisors for your own specific issues. Otherwise, we also will be giving you a decision on your forgiveness amount as part of our review process before we submit your application to the SBA. So keep that in mind. So what has changed in forgiveness in the last 2 months? The answer is not a lot. We're going to give you a quick brief update on the latest changes. As before, you all know the CARES Act was signed into effect back in April. There has been in the 20s now in terms of changes to guidance, to interim final rules, to SBA Q&A. There's just continuing to issue additional guidance as we go here. The very latest thing, we've heard a lot of questions from you all because you're hearing through the media that maybe the process is going to get even more streamlined for smaller business borrowers. And while that is certainly being contemplated in Congress right now, they're at a deadlock, and they're being urged by industry groups, bank groups, to consider a standalone Paycheck Protection Program legislation and to strip it out from some of the other stimulus, the CARES 2.0 projects that are being contemplated. But they're still not getting a whole lot of traction on that. The Senate has put out a version of the bill, as well as the House has put out their own version of the bill, which industry groups are strongly encouraging they contemplate and they consider. And they would create basically a one-page, more simplified certification application for forgiveness for loans of $150,000 or less. The reason I bring that up is because if you have not yet submitted the application to us through the online portal that we have made available, that you should have received via email, and you have a loan that's $150,000 or less, know that there may be additional changes to the application process for you all. Anybody with more than $150,000 loan amount, we're going to really focus today's efforts on talking you through how that process looks today, and we will answer questions, as I mentioned, as we go. So the latest big change to the PPP loan process was back in June when they issued the PPP Flexibility Act. And on that particular bill, what they did is they changed it so that you don't have to spend 75% or more of the loan forgiveness amount on your payroll costs in order to get full forgiveness. They've dropped that threshold to 60% or more. So that should provide some flexibility for folks in how they've spent their proceeds. Now, the other great thing that this rule did do is it provided for an alternate covered period date. It moved from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. Now, the original 8 weeks still exists for folks that were interested in getting that done in the 8-week period. But what we're seeing and hearing from our customers is if they are waiting the 24 weeks, they can use the payroll costs to substantiate their entire forgiveness amount. So, for example, maybe after a 20-week period, you've spent your entire loan balance on payroll because of the additional weeks. We're recommending that you actually consider that, because then all you have to supply to us is your payroll documentation, and you don't need to get into the weeds on some of the utility bills and the rent payments, because once you've done 100% of your loan proceeds on payroll costs, then it's a really easy hurdle for you to meet there. You may still elect to use June 30th if you had to restore employment under the prior rule, but anybody who is going to be restoring wages or FTE in order to get forgiveness can now wait until the end of December to do that. These exemptions also exist, as we've listed for you down below here, and it does create a lot of flexibility for you all, because if you were unable to hire individuals who were employees back in February, and you were unable to hire similarly qualified employees by that time period, then you don't have to meet that threshold to restore your count. But this last one is probably the one that's going to apply to most of our local businesses, and that's your ability to evidence to the SBA that you were unable to return to your pre-pandemic levels of business activity due to federal closure requirements. So let's say, for example, that you're a restaurant. Your restaurant was unable to serve people in your location because of the COVID restrictions. And it took you a while to get started before you could start serving people out on the street or maybe in an outdoor environment. And because of that, you have been unable to restore your original levels of business activity, and you can prove that, then you're not going to be held as closely to these exemptions for restoring. So just keep that in mind. You will need to provide evidence of this state mandate or the countywide mandate that impacts your business. So make sure you keep note of that. Okay, so the online portal, as I mentioned, I believe we've emailed links to apply to about 400 of our clients thus far. So don't be alarmed if you haven't yet received one. It's likely because your loan amount is $150 or less. And, you know, we know that some of you are interested in waiting to see what happens in Congress. But for those of you that have received their applications, we do ask that you go into the application and let us know whether you're going to elect the 8 weeks or the 24 weeks. So this box up here shows you how that looks in your application form. Click the radio button that corresponds to your covered period, and make sure you hit save. If you don't want to complete the application at this point, that's fine. Click save, and it will go to the back office where we can see how long you're going to take to spend your proceeds. But don't hit submit, because your application will be deemed incomplete and it will mess other things up. There is another alternative payroll covered period that you can use if you're paying your employees, you know, every 2 weeks rather than twice a month. And if that's the case, you can actually start your covered period on the date following where your payroll period starts. And you don't need to worry too much about it, because based on the options that you select here on the application, it will automatically populate with the dates and do the calculations for you. So that will take care of that. You're going to need to know the employees that you had at the time of loan application. So make sure you know how many employees you have. Also, you're going to need to know the number of employees that you have at the time you submit your forgiveness application. This is different than what you've been hearing about in terms of how you calculate your FTE to determine whether you've reduced your headcount. This is really just telling the SBA, here's the employees I had at application, and you can base this on whatever you like. You don't have to stick to the FTE calculations. If it's easier and you've got 20 employees, they aren't all full-time, you would just put 20 employees in here. We just ask that you maintain the consistency and use that same method when you're determining the number of employees you have at the forgiveness application point. Later, we'll talk about how to calculate FTE for terms of the safe harbor on FTE reduction. Now, remember, we're going to require evidence of your FTE. It typically will be your payroll tax filings reported, or that will be reported to the IRS, typically on a Form 941. We'll also need to see state quarterly business and individual employee wage reporting and unemployment insurance, because all those withholdings will have to be demonstrated and current so we can submit you for forgiveness. Okay. Off to the bottom, the FTE reductions, this is straight out of our portal. It'll take you step by step through what to do in determining your FTE reductions. Now, as I mentioned previously, while there are also guidelines maybe forthcoming to streamline the application process for smaller loan amounts, there already is, based on the June release, a new easy form application that we're going to talk about. And I encourage anybody that does qualify for this easy form to use it, because you won't have to worry about going through this whole FTE reduction business. So let's go through that now. All right, so the easy form, it really is a lot easier, and I'll show you what the screens look like in just a minute here. You qualify if you're going to only report one employee. So if you key in one employee, just know to yourself that you likely qualify for this easy form, and you can make your life a whole lot easier. And that's if you're self-employed, you're an independent contractor, or sole proprietor with no employees. What you would do is you would check that box on the top there that says you're self-employed. What we want to make sure that you do, see down at the bottom on the left there is a button that you need to toggle. And when you say yes and toggle it to yes, what the system will do is it will automatically streamline your whole application so that you don't have to put in all the wage reduction and FTE reduction information. There is another situation where you can also qualify for the easy form, even if you do have multiple employees. And that's where you did not reduce salary or hourly wages of your individual employees, and you did not reduce your FTE. Let's say you did reduce your FTE, but you didn't reduce anybody's salary or wages. You still can qualify for this form, again, if you were unable to operate at full capacity due to the government mandates related to COVID. So that's that exemption we talked about previously, where if you have evidence and documentation that a mandated closure has impacted your ability to operate, you're going to get some more streamlined processing for your forgiveness application. A question is coming through on the chat wanting to know who should we contact to see if the application has been sent to us. So what we can do is there is a PPP email address that we will shoot out in the chat box for all of you that are interested in contacting them to see if your application has been sent. If you're self-employed and you have a one-person LLC, again, you should be able to use the easy form because you're going to list one employee on your application. So you would go ahead and check this. You're a self-employed individual in this case, so that should be good. All right. Next page, I told you we would show you what the easy form looks like. This is really all that it takes. You're going to key in your employee compensation. There's guidelines throughout the application process to take you step by step through how to complete the application. One thing that I do want to encourage you all to do, it's a very self-service portal. You see the question marks on the screen there. If you hover over those question marks, it'll give you direct guidance out of the regulation about what you want to include here, what's covered, what's not covered. I do also want to encourage you that this employee compensation should not include owner compensation as well. There's going to be a separate section for the compensation of the owner if that's something that you're choosing to submit for your forgiveness application. Okay, so make sure this is just for your employees. Non-payroll costs, you're just going to key in the date that you made the payment, the amount, and the description. Now, again, I want to encourage you that if you've opted for the 24 weeks, you likely have been able to spend your total loan amount on payroll costs by that point, because remember, you were only approved for 2.5 times your average monthly payroll cost for the loan amount. The 24 weeks does not mean that you can get additional payroll money. It just means that you have 24 weeks now to actually spend that money on payroll. So as I mentioned before, a lot of our customers we're seeing are able to just wait, 19, 20 weeks, dole out all of their proceeds for payroll, and that's all the documentation they then need to submit. You'll also see on these boxes here, it says to upload documents. We will not be able to consider your application unless you've uploaded documentation to support the numbers, and make sure that whatever you upload to each of these line items, that the numbers match up and they total what you intended it to do on the line item. We will also be verifying the original loan amount as part of our forgiveness review because the SBA does that. So make sure that if you didn't provide us your 941s at the time of application, we will be requiring that because we do need to verify that your loan amount was accurate in the beginning. You do need to supply documentation for every expense. There's a couple of interesting things that have changed over the last couple of months. The regulations say that these expenses must be incurred and paid during the covered period. You'll notice that says or, because what the revised guidelines said to us is if you've incurred it prior to your forgiveness period starting, prior to receiving your loan, let's say you started paying your employees, but the actual expense for that payroll comes out in the middle of the covered period, then that will be okay. Originally, we were guided that we had to back out the costs that happened before the covered period, but now if it was incurred or paid during the covered period, you can count that. What you can't count is prepaying. So let's say you pay something during the covered period that isn't due for 2 or 3 months, like your rent or like a lease payment or something like that. Those will not be considered because under the questions and answers, it specifically says that things like mortgage interest cannot be prepaid. So they do want to see that it's a cost that was incurred during your covered period and not something you're just trying to pay out in advance. Let's see. Self-employed with 1 employee. No reduction in wages, does that qualify for the easy form? So that's an interesting question. If there's 2 of you, is what I'm assuming from the question, so it's yourself and 1 employee, and you're a sole prop or something like that, and there's been no reduction in wages, it could qualify for the easy form if you can prove that your business operations were impacted and you were unable to fully meet the revenue that you were previously generating because of mandated closures. So remember that. I can take it back to that slide one more time. Again, it's if you did not reduce the salary or wages and did not reduce your FTE, so that's another way that you could qualify, or if you did not reduce and were unable to operate. So for the person that has asked that question, if you did not reduce your FTE, if you always had yourself and 1 other person, then yeah, you should be able to qualify for that easy form. And you'll see there's a box on the form eligibility that allows you to check which of those options that you're going with. Okay. I'm going to move it forward again. Off to the right, you'll see that our application will automatically calculate your estimated forgiveness amount. And it's going to be the lesser of the loan amount. So you won't ever be able to get more than your original loan amount, or the forgiveness amount. Or what they do is they also take a factor to make sure that 60% or more of what you're spending has been on payroll. And they'll take those three calculations, and the lesser of will become your forgiveness amount. Okay. All right, now let's say you don't qualify for the easy form, and maybe you have reduced wages for individual employees, or you're not a sole proprietor or something like that. If you do need to go through the full application, it does get to be a lot more work. So remember, that easy form is available for self-employed, and if you have not reduced your wages or your FTE, or you have that other COVID closure exemption that we talked about. If you don't toggle that little box over to easy form yes, you'll get the full application process. So there's a couple of things that are going to happen here. We do provide you with an online tool with a downloadable spreadsheet to populate this form. You can see at the top of that you can download a blank worksheet, upload a completed worksheet. It may be that your CPA has provided you with another tool. You can upload that as well. It's just that it won't automatically populate these fields unless you use our worksheet here. So it's whatever's easiest for you. If you've already got the work done in an Excel spreadsheet because your CPA has helped you, or you've used another online resource or tool, then you would just key the data directly into these fields. And as I mentioned before, the supporting documentation needs to be uploaded, and you would just click to upload your documentation off to the right of each of these line items. Again, you will be receiving your email invitation with a customized link that goes straight to your application. You'll be issued a PIN that you can share with your CPA or anybody else that might be helping you with the forgiveness application. So that should be pretty slick. Let's see. The next page, this is the downloadable spreadsheet, and I'm only providing a screenshot for you here so you can see the types of things that you'll need to make sure you have at the ready to complete it. And again, this is very helpful if you don't have another way to do it. If you don't complete all of this data in a spreadsheet that's uploaded per Appendix A of the SBA's application form, then we won't be able to move forward with the application. So it's really important that if you don't use our tool, you use one that's going to be compliant with the rules. At the top of our PPP page, we do provide some additional free online tools. I think it's the AICPA has put out a version that you may choose to use for yourself as well if this one doesn't work for your purposes. But again, the nice thing about using the downloadable spreadsheet within the tool is it will automatically populate the forgiveness application. All right, a couple of other things that are going to be necessary on this long form of the forgiveness application that aren't necessary on the easy form are the information on your FTE reduction, okay? So you complete the salary and wage reduction column only for those employees whose wages or salaries were reduced by more than 25% from the period of Q1 2020. So you're going to look at Q1 2020, and if in these other covered periods that are listed for you below, and again, they're reiterated in the application, there's question marks for you to hover over so you know exactly what dates they're referring to. It should make it pretty easy if you follow the tips. If you didn't reduce wages, then you don't need to complete this piece of the application. So keep that in mind. You'll also need to provide us with a couple of other things. We're going to need, as I mentioned before, your full-time equivalent count for your employees. Now, again, this is different than the front page of the application that asks for employee count. This is FTE, which has to be calculated a very specific way. So down there on the bottom, you'll see in the orange, average FTE can be calculated by either taking all of the hours worked by your employees and dividing that by 40 hours, or there's an alternative method if you don't track hours in that way. What you would do is you would assign a 1 count to any employee working 40 hours or more. So those of us that work long hours, we don't get to count ourselves as 2 people, even though it feels like sometimes we're functioning in that capacity. And then what you would do is you would assign a 0.5 for any employee that works fewer than 40 hours. Okay, so those are the two methods that you can use. As I'm going through this rather quickly, I do want to point out to you that on our PPP webpage, we do have FAQs based on all of this. So this is all derived from our online FAQs. We just tried to put it together in a more visual format for you. You're also going to need to provide a list of your employees with their salaries. We need to see individual employee salaries who made less than $100,000, and that's why we need to see their individual salaries, because if they exceed that, they're going to get capped on what you can get forgiven. You'll also need documentation on any employees who were not employed in 2019. So let's say you're looking at last year's count. Things are a little bit different this year. So you're going to need to provide documentation of any of those new hires in 2020 that weren't part of your 2019 information. And then again, you'll need to provide a separate list of employees who received more than $100,000. This is all right in the application tool, and it'll guide you through if you just follow the process. Okay. All right, maximizing loan forgiveness. I'm going to say this probably 2 more times at least. If you've waited 24 weeks and you've been able to spend 100% of your loans and evidence that you've got payroll costs for your total loan amount, stop. You don't have to listen any further. This is going to get really in the weeds, and we encourage you to make life easier on yourself. That said, if you haven't been able to spend the money on payroll and you do need to have some other eligible expenses in order to qualify for forgiveness, we're going to go through some of the details here, along with some of the common issues we're seeing on documentation that we've been reviewing thus far. Before anybody asks, we have, I believe, about 100 or so applications locked and ready to go with the SBA. We have not gotten a single decision yet from the SBA on any of our applications. They're still trying to get their process figured out, and we're still waiting for our very first response back from them. That said, there have been some questions on timing in the chat box and how long the process takes. Later in the presentation, I have a slide on timing and how that works. The law says that we have 60 days to decision your application, and that the SBA then has 90 days to make their decision. I will tell you that in reality, that's not how long it's taking us. As I mentioned, we've got quite a few in the pipe. The one thing I would suggest is if you're in a hurry to determine if you're going to get forgiven, the very best thing that you can do is complete the application fully and entirely before you hit the submit button to us. When we have to start doing that back and forth and asking for additional documentation because you didn't upload it, that's where things start to take a long time, and we're not going to be able to react or decision them as quickly as you would like, okay? So the very first thing you can do is ensure that the loan is only spent on eligible expenses. There's some things that we've been seeing from customers that just aren't eligible that we'll cover in just a little bit. And again, throughout the application process, if you hover over the question marks, it'll tell you what's eligible in different categories. So I'm going to move forward on this, but remember that if you're spending 100% of your proceeds on payroll expenses, then a lot of this is going to be something you don't need to worry about. Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to cover some of the common issues that we've been seeing with our applications received to date. First of all, I'm going to suggest turn off your pop-up blocker, because that's the common issue that we've been seeing in these applications. For things to pop up and show you the special tips, you're going to need to turn off that blocker so that you can see the tips and the tricks that are suggested throughout the application. Now, when people are submitting applications with other eligible expenses for non-payroll items, we're seeing some common errors. First off, the bills that you submit and the proof of payment of those bills need to clearly show your name and the date of the bill. It can't just be a screenshot if it doesn't show who it is, who it's for, and what the time period it is that's covering it. So make sure that you're not cutting things off as you're doing your scanning and that everything is visible. When you're looking for proof of payment, there's a couple of things you can do. Let's say you give us a bill for the month of June. You're also going to need to show proof of payment, and you can do that a couple of different ways, either by giving us your July statement as well to show that that payment was made, or a copy of the check or ACH to show proof of your payment for that bill. And as I mentioned previously, it has to be incurred or paid during the covered period, but you also cannot prepay these expenses, so keep that in mind. Probably easiest to scan the bill with the proof of payment together to expedite the review so that we don't have to go looking for it. But again, we understand that not everybody has easy access to scanners. Maybe it's easier to do it on the phone one at a time, whatever is easiest for you. But if you do want a really fast and quick process, just make sure your documentation is all housed together. Make sure that those bills that you upload do add up to the amount that you listed on that line item, as I talked about previously. Lastly, if you're going to try to get qualification for rent expenses during the covered period, we're going to need evidence that your service, your utility service, or your lease for the rent was in effect prior to February 15th and for at least 1 month after the covered period. So it can't be a lease that ends during the covered period. So make sure that you do upload copies of those leases. And we'll talk in a little bit about limitations on eligible expenses when you're looking at lease payments. Namely, just know that you cannot get credit for forgiveness for a rent payment that's made to a related party. So if one of your owners is leasing you the building that you operate in, that is not going to be an eligible expense for forgiveness. All that you'll be able to use is the mortgage interest on that building for forgiveness. With payroll, the common things that we're seeing on payroll is that we don't have all evidence of the employment taxes and the withholdings being paid. We're going to need a copy of your 940 and your 941, even if it's not yet reported, as well as your EDD filing. So those documents are going to be necessary as part of the application process. Important to note, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the expenses that are not eligible. And it's important to note that the employer paid portion of federal taxes cannot be included for forgiveness. It's the employee paid portion that you can get credit for. The payroll journal must also include individual salaries, as I mentioned, so we can ensure that no employee exceeds $100,000. You will need a separate owner compensation documentation, and we'll talk about what that looks like in just a minute here. Probably the easiest thing that we're seeing payroll documentation of all different kinds. Easiest thing to do would be to contact your payroll provider, because most of them are offering a PPP specific report. And if they're doing that, that makes your life really easy and it allows you to fill out this application very quickly. Note that we're also going to need copies of your bank statements showing when the payroll expense was withdrawn from the account. It can't be a screenshot. It does need to be a downloaded copy of your statement, again with your name and your account number showing the expense. And we ask that you provide this even if you bank with our bank, just because it needs to be uploaded into the portal. We can't take it from our core system and send it to the SBA that way. So it does need to be within the tool. The other nice thing about uploading your expenses within the portal is one of the SBA's new processes is a loan review function. And when they reach out to us on an individual customer's application for forgiveness, we have only 5 days to turn around that documentation to make sure that they don't yank you and put you into a further review. Again, they have the ability to review a file for as long as 90 days, but we don't know how that's quite going to look yet. But part of the reason we're having you upload all this documentation within the tool is so that we can quickly respond to the SBA and get you your forgiveness as fast as you would like. Okay. There's a question, do we need to use the quarterly 941 for the head count, or can we use a payroll register? Again, if your payroll vendor provides specific PPP reports, those are great. Go ahead and leverage that. We do still need a copy of the 941 to make sure that you're paying your taxes, but most vendors are going to have a PPP specific report. Let's see, another question. Were you going to mention how a sole owner, no employees, uses the easy form? That's easy. That, as I mentioned previously, that very first radio button on the easy form eligibility, that very first one says you're a sole owner, no employees, and you get to use the easy form. So it really is that easy. Do you notify the borrower when the application is submitted to the SBA? That's a good question. Actually, our online portal has automatic communications that let you know all kinds of things. You'll be able to log in and check the status of your file, and you'll be working with a specific bank employee that can answer questions on your behalf. So that'll make life easy and keep for really good communication throughout the process. The emails are great too because it allows you to respond back and to track the status of what's going on with your file. Somebody said, I missed what you said in the beginning about loans under $150,000. What is Congress debating? Congress for months now has been talking about a more streamlined application process for loans $150,000 or under. We don't know what that's going to look like yet. Some are saying it's a one-page certification form, but once the bill, if it ever goes into effect, gets passed, then we have to wait for the SBA to issue additional guidance. So it's still too soon to tell. Again, if you qualify for the easy form, it really is an easy process to get through, and I would recommend that if you qualify for the easy form, make sure you toggle the button so that you can get that through. What we've been doing is, as new developments are happening, we have been publishing those via our online blog available on our website. We've been sending out client emails, and we've been doing these webinars and podcasts. So if things do change in Congress, and I wouldn't anticipate for the next several months that to be happening, we will keep you posted. But even if you have less than $150,000 in your loan amount right now, that easy form is really simple for you to get through too. What is the documentation needed for the sole owner for wages? That's a good question, and we're going to cover it in just a minute. But because I don't want to keep you waiting, it's really just your Schedule C from your 2019 return. So we're going to need a copy of your Schedule C, and then your forgiveness amount is going to be limited to what you did in 2019. So they don't really need to see anything else. You just you upload your Schedule C on your 2019 return, and they can take a look at what you spent on your own individual payroll costs. Okay. Let's see. The deadline to submit the forgiveness application. There really isn't a deadline per se. What the Act has done is it's given you this 24-week window for which to apply. The important thing to keep note of, though, is your payments are only deferred for 10 months following your loan proceeds being issued. So if you received your loan 10 months from that date, the SBA is going to stop deferring your payments, and we're going to start collecting monthly payments. So it's important that you do apply for forgiveness prior to that 10-month period being up. The application process before 12/31, you really should be getting your applications in by that time, just to make sure that you don't end up having to start your monthly payments at the end of that 10-month period. So be cautious of that. But again, no real deadline to submit. We do encourage you to go take a look at the application, and again, tell us whether you're going to do 8 or 24 weeks, and then you can save it. But take a look at the application to see when you might want to apply. And really, it's important to do what's best for your business. It doesn't make sense to rush the application if you're not going to qualify for full forgiveness yet. But if you've met all the requirements and are ready to apply, and you think you're going to be fully forgiven, then by all means, go ahead and do that now. Okay, payroll expenses. As I mentioned, there's been some changes in what payroll expenses are considered. It's gross salary, wages, commissions, and tips. This has not changed from the original CARES Act in April. It is important to know that you can't get forgiveness for more than per employee, because remember, they don't let you get forgiveness for the employees that make more than $100,000 in an annual year. So if they've made more than $100,000, then what happens is their salary gets capped. So what they've done is they've taken that $100,000 and done some fancy math, and they've come up with this cap per employee of $15,385. Vacation, if you've had separations or dismissals, those count as well. And again, it's the employer contribution for the employee's health care coverage and the employer's contribution for the employee's retirement plans. Also, you can get credit for payment of state and local taxes assessed on compensation of employees, but remember, federal are not eligible, okay? Now, independent contractors, payroll costs only include your wages, net earnings, similar compensation. We'll go over individual scenarios in just a minute here. Okay, as I mentioned, we do have FAQs on our website. You can visit us at www.americanrivierbank.com. Right at the top of the page, there's a link to our COVID resources that'll take you directly to a PPP page where you can see all of our FAQs. As I mentioned, the $100,000 caps your loan forgiveness. Oh, goodness, little extra digit there. Forget the 4 on the end. And the way they came up with that, again, is they took the $100,000, they divided it by 52 weeks, and then they multiplied that out over 8. So keep in mind that even though 24 weeks is now a possibility, that does not mean that you get 24 weeks worth of payroll forgiven, because it's still limited to 2.5 times your average monthly payroll, which you might remember is how we arrived at your PPP loan amount when we first approved your loan. You'll only be able to reach this cap on employees, this $46,000 cap on employees, if you ended up reducing other employees' hours or wages, because otherwise you're just not going to be able to gather that. So make sure that you're understanding that properly, that we aren't able to give you more money because of the 24 weeks. It just allows you more time to spend the money, okay? And we don't come up with all of this ourselves. This is directly out of the SBA FAQs. We've just tried to put them in a format and a location where they're easy for you to find. This is all on our website as well. C Corp owner employees are capped by your 2019 cash compensation. And again, they're going to be relying on what you paid yourself in 2019. For an S Corp, you're capped by your 2019 employer compensation. The difference here is your employer health contributions cannot be separately added because those are already included for an S Corp. Okay, general partners are here. There's a calculation you're going to use. And as I mentioned, if you're self-employed or a sole prop, you're going to use your Schedule C or F. You're going to be capped based on your 2019 net profit. So there's a calculation guide for you here. And that no additional forgiveness is provided for retirement or health contributions for self-employed because they're already paid out of your net self-employment income, okay? There's been a couple of questions about how to do all of that, so hopefully that helps to answer all of that. Okay, non-payroll expenses. Let's talk a little bit about these more complex items here. And again, as I mentioned, if you've already spent all your money on payroll, you're good to go. You don't need to pay a lot of attention to these next couple slides. We are highly encouraging, it'll be 24 weeks for most of your applications in the month of October. So if you wait the full 24 weeks and spend all of the loan proceeds on salaries, you don't need to even worry about all of it. So remember, non-payroll expenses, mortgage interest payments for the business on real or personal property do qualify as an eligible expense. The debt has to be incurred before February 15th, 2020, though. Now, this next one is really important. Rent or lease payments are also eligible for forgiveness, but they have to be with an unrelated party. They cannot be one of the owners of the business that's leasing your space. Again, in those scenarios, you will only get forgiveness for the mortgage interest paid on a property that the owner owns, not for the lease payments themselves. Utility payments for the business for electricity and gas, internet access, again, if the service began before February 15th. So we're going to need evidence of when that service was initiated. I'm going to cover a little bit more on the documentation that's going to be required for each of these expenses on the next couple of slides. There's a good question on the chat right now. Could 100% of PPP loan forgiveness be achieved if a company also received an EIDL advance? That's a good question. What happened in August is SBA came out with new guidance that said that they will automatically deduct from your forgiveness amount the EIDL advance that customers received. That's new. In the CARES Act itself, they had contemplated only that EIDLs did not have to be repaid. But in their mind, this was double dipping because you get the advance plus the PPP loans. So what we understand they're going to do is withhold that $10,000 advance from your forgiveness amount. So you will likely have a $10,000 balance if you've received an advance. So just keep that in mind. Again, the SBA has changed from the original CARES Act in April. We're still waiting to see if that's going to be changed further, but at this point, it does not look like it. It looks like their system has been set up to automatically do that. The accrued interest will need to be repaid regardless of forgiveness. No. So your interest is deferred on these loans, as I mentioned, for 10 months. Originally, those of you that applied before the Flexibility Act came about, it was, I think, a 6-month deferred period. So those of you that haven't achieved full forgiveness by November are going to want to take a look at whether or not you're going to have to pay that money back. If you do have to pay any of the loan proceeds back, it'll be amortized over a term for your loan. Right now, the loans are booked at a 2-year repayment period with a 1% interest rate, and you would start paying on that if any of your loan balance has not been forgiven at the end of that deferment period. So 10 months out, you start paying on that, and that's when your accrued interest is going to become due. But if you apply right now and you get forgiven before all of that starts to happen, then no, you're free and clear, and you don't need to pay that loan back. It does effectively function as a government grant. Okay, so some other tips on this. As I mentioned before, rent paid to related parties is not eligible. We're going to need proof of the payment to show that the rent paid is not one of your owners. We'll also need a copy of the lease with the third party to show who's leasing you the space. Mortgage interest on real or personal property is eligible. We'll need a copy of the mortgage. Again, it's going to need to show that the mortgage was in effect prior to February. We'll need an invoice or a statement showing the interest that you paid and proof of that payment of that interest. Both rent and mortgage have to show that they're applicable to at least 1 month beyond your covered PPP loan period. Okay, so it needs to be clear that you're actually going to still be paying on that rent at least 1 month beyond. Please know that other documents may be requested. The SBA does continue to change guidance. And if they do select your loan for review, it's possible that they're going to require additional documentation. Bank statements need to be supplied. Screenshots aren't going to work because it needs to show the bank logo, your name, your account number. We may also have to request 2019 tax returns. Since the extension deadline has passed, we're concerned that the SBA is going to start making that a requirement. You may have heard on the news they're very focused on PPP loan fraud these days, and we're not sure if that's going to be a requirement going forward. As I mentioned previously, please review the application for completeness before you hit that submit button. You can save as many times as you like, but once you hit submit, it's going to create a lot of back and forth if it's not complete. So make sure you take note of that. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we do have a lot of questions on timing and when the loan can potentially get forgiven. So there's some scenarios. That very first one is the 8-week period from the original application. It's possible you can get forgiven before the end of the year even, Even if the SBA takes their full 90 days and we take a full 60 days to review it, it's possible you can get fully forgiven in this year, which would be fantastic. In the second scenario there, we're using the alternative covered period that I mentioned previously. If you're biweekly payments, where you start your payroll a little bit differently. Instead of starting on April 20th in this scenario, it would start on April 26th, which is the date of your first payroll. In that case, you're probably still going to be able to get forgiveness before the end of the year. Okay. In the bottom scenario, that's the new 24-week period. And it's possible that you can still get forgiveness. Not likely that you'll get forgiveness by the end of the year. Your covered period could technically still end in October. And if we were to turn around an application decision within 30 days, it's still going to be tight if the SBA takes a full 90 days to review their application. And as I mentioned before, we've been submitting applications since they first became available for us to submit. I know many institutions waited till at least September 15th to even accept applications, but we wanted to get you all your service as quickly as possible, so we started right away. We have still yet to receive any decision back from the SBA, so they are taking some time, unfortunately. Okay, so required documentation. The payroll documentation, we're going to need to see bank account statements. It says or third-party service provider reports. We're actually needing both of them. So go ahead and give us your payroll provider reports. Hopefully, again, they have the PPP-specific documentation and the bank statement, because one will show the employees that you paid, the other will show proof of the payment that we've talked about previously. Tax forms or other equivalents, and make sure that your quarterly wage reporting is current and up to date. Even if you haven't filed it yet, we're going to need those filings. Payment receipts, canceled checks will work. We just need evidence that the payment has happened. FTE count, we need documentation showing the number of FTE for the reference period from that step 2 that we talked about in the application. The documents may include payroll tax filings. Typically, it's going to be your 941 and state quarterly wage reporting and uninsurance tax filings, but it may also be on your payroll provided reports, so that works as well. We've already talked about these non-payroll expenses, and we've already discussed the fact that sole proprietors are limited to the salaries they were paid on their 2019 filed returns. Again, that extension of July 15th has come and gone, and we've all had to file our taxes. So you're going to need to go ahead and provide evidence of that 2019 return. Also want to reiterate that documentation must be retained by the borrower for 6 years, and that's because the SBA can always come back. The borrower is going to have this documentation for 6 years, and even if the SBA doesn't require it because they don't select your file for review, you aren't going to get a free pass on that. You're going to need to make sure that you have these following 4 items in the event that they solicit you for a review later down the road. Under the SBA's new process, they can look at a loan anytime, any place, anywhere, and it's important to know this. One other thing to keep in mind in terms of documentation, we talked previously about the full-time equivalent headcount exemption for if you made an offer to rehire somebody and you were unable to find another qualified worker. You only get that exclusion if you then report to your state unemployment insurance offer the fact that your employee rejected that offer. And you have to do that within 30 days of the rejection. So keep in mind that that documentation will be required if you opt for that exemption. And as I mentioned, the SBA did issue guidance. They have a whole new interim final rule on the SBA loan review process. And some people were misinformed, thinking that if your loan amount was less than $2 million, that you didn't need to do a whole lot, no big deal, and that the SBA would never review you. That is not true. What the SBA said in their FAQ was that any loans less than $2 million will be deemed to have made that good faith requirement that they applied for the PPP loan and that the proceeds were necessary to help with operation of their business. So you might remember at the application process, you signed a certification saying that, yes, this money is necessary. What this FAQ said is if your loan amount's under $2 million, we're going to deem you to automatically be in good faith with that compliant. For loans over $2 million, they're going to validate that to see if you really truly did need the money. But that doesn't mean that the rest of you are off the hook, because the new interim final rule that the SBA issued on the loan review process says that they can take a look at any PPP loan of any size at any time at their discretion. And as I mentioned, they're going to reaffirm, if they select you for review, the loan amount that you applied for to make sure you were truly eligible for that amount, in addition to looking at were you an eligible type of borrower, and did you do the right, did you spend the money on the right things, and are you truly eligible for loan forgiveness? So they can do that at any time now. So we made it through the hour. There's just a couple of questions that I want to be able to address while we're all online together. I realize you probably all have other places to go. There is a question about whether or not you can submit your forgiveness application if you spent your entire proceeds, but it's not yet 24 weeks. Yes, you can do it as soon as you spent that money. You do not have to wait until the end of the 24 weeks. In certain scenarios where maybe you're going to end up restoring your FTE count or your wages, if you want to wait the full 24 weeks to do the restoration, then you would wait so that you could supply to the SBA your data at 24 weeks because you've hired people back. But if you don't need that exemption, you can go ahead and apply at week 15, 16, 19, whatever it is, if you've elected the 24 weeks. All right, and I think that means we are just right on top of the hour here. There's a couple more questions that we can take a look at. Let's see. Actually, I think most of these are addressed. There are some very specific questions for customers. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and put a written answer together for those so that we can get that out to all of you. If you do have specific questions after that comes out, we are here to help, so make sure you let us know. And if any of these questions are not already on our FAQ, what we'll do is we'll be adding your questions to our website. So we thank you for your participation today and for being such active listeners, and we hope you're all well. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.